When it comes to modern air warfare, we hear terms like air superiority and air supremacy thrown around a lot. But do they have a meaning besides just winning the war? The short answer to that is yes. But like with anything related to air warfare, the US Air Force has a much longer answer. And they have a picture to go along with it too. This is called the control of the air continuum, and just like the name implies, control of the air is not a binary on-off state. It's more like a tug of war with varying levels of success for each side involved. At the center is air parity, which is described as a condition in which no force has control of the air. Now, this doesn't mean a standoff. It's typified by intensely contested battles at critical points during an operation. With air parity, it's important to remember that air operations still happen, but with significant interference by the other side. As the scale of control slides in one direction, we'll see one side gain air superiority. Here's how the Air Force describes that. That degree of control of the air by one force that permits the conduct of its operations at a given time and place without prohibitive interference from air and missile threats. I'm going to leave the last part up on the screen so we can compare it to how the Air Force describes air supremacy. Here's air supremacy's definition. That degree of control of the air wherein the opposing force is incapable of effective interference within the operational area using air and missile threats. Now, these are some very wordy academic definitions, but there are a couple words that help to spell things out for us: prohibitive and effective. That's really what air superiority and supremacy are about. Let's take a look at some past examples to demonstrate what I mean. In 1991's Operation Desert Storm, the air campaign was one where we saw the US-led coalition unquestionably take control of the skies over Iraq. The Iraqi efforts to regain control were pretty sporadic. It was mostly characterized by small numbers of interceptors quickly being shot down or individual air defense units acting independently. Overall, they didn't provide any effective interference with coalition air operations. If they are incapable of effective interference, then that means the coalition had air supremacy. Now let's fast forward to 1999 with Operation Allied Force over Serbia in the breakaway Kosovo region. In this operation, NATO lost an F-117 stealth fighter to ground-based air defenses, as well as several other notable incidents. Shooting down a stealth fighter with the SAM certainly counts as effective interference. So air supremacy was not achieved. But the Serbian military could never prohibit NATO's operations over their airspace. So we can't call it prohibitive interference. This means NATO had air superiority over the region. One thing to remember here is that control of the air isn't necessarily the same over the entire area of operations. It can be different depending on where you are. A good example of this is the US war in Vietnam. Throughout the war, the North Vietnamese military couldn't provide effective interference using air and missile threats located in South Vietnam. There were several examples of ground fire from guns in the South, but the definition is pretty specific about air and missile threats. So the US had air supremacy in South Vietnam. But things were drastically different in the North, where there was very effective interference from air and missile threats. But they could never truly prohibit American air operations over North Vietnam. So the US had air superiority in the North and air supremacy in the South. In future conflicts, we're likely to see more scenarios like that. It may even get to the point where all 5 steps on the continuum might be present across the battlefield. Now we know the definition of air supremacy, but how does that actually work in practice? The answer isn't a short one, and it's going to take several videos to completely explain. But all of that can be summarized in one word: teamwork. Whether it's from an intel gathering plane, or the analyst team making sense of what that plane picked up, or an AWACS controller talking to a fighter pilot flying a defensive patrol, air supremacy is a product of every individual's contribution to the larger Air Force team. The cornerstone of the air supremacy team effort is the Defensive Counter-Air Combat Air Patrol, which we'll call the DCA CAP for short. Once you understand DCA, it's a lot easier to expand out into other areas like offensive counter-air, so we'll cover that one first. Simply put, a DCA CAP is a formation of fighters charged with protecting a piece of airspace. If any uninvited aircraft enter the area, then it will be the DCA CAP that responds. This could be a simple intercept for a civilian that strayed into a restricted area, or even an armed response to an enemy bomber. You can think of a DCA fighter patrol as the police patrol for an area. They respond to 911 calls provided to them by controllers either on the ground or in an AWACS aircraft. DCA flights can also be tasked with protecting high-value aerial assets like tankers, JSTARS, and AWACS. The DCA cap isn't something found only in rear areas near important sites. They can also be placed directly over friendly ground forces advancing into enemy territory. As the Air Force says, control of the air is a necessary precondition for control of the surface. We've seen how true that statement is several times in operations like Desert Storm and Allied Force. But it's more than just having a DCA cap presence that makes air supremacy happen. There's a lot of communication and coordination going on too. Everyone needs to operate on a shared set of terminology. They also need to have a shared set of geographic references. Saying, "at my position," on the radio doesn't give any other listeners any real indication of where you're trying to direct their attention. But if the theater commander gives a spot on the map to the name Bullseye, now everyone knows exactly what you mean. All your teammates also need a way to positively identify you as a friend to avoid friendly fire incidents. Each of these topics will get its own dedicated video explaining how it's done in the real world. In the next video, I wanted to explain how US and NATO air power is organized. The best way to do that is to follow the path an order takes from the very top of the organization down to the individual pilot that will carry it out. Now, before I end this video, I wanted to cover one last set of definitions. When people talk about different levels of warfare, you often hear the words strategic, tactical, and sometimes even operational. Air supremacy happens at all three levels, so it's important to know what each of them mean. The DOD has this to say on the topic. The three levels of warfare, strategic, operational, and tactical, link tactical actions to achievement of national objectives. There are no finite limits or boundaries between these levels. So if there aren't any limits, how do we know them? It's pretty simple, actually. When it comes to national objectives, it's strategic. As an example, the decision to enact a no-fly zone falls into the category of strategic. Decisions made about how a unit acts in a battle, or orders to subordinates in the immediate area, are all tactical in nature. Most people understand the tactical arena very well since it's easy to define. But a common mistake, even in the military, is to lump everything that's not tactical into strategic. But there are certain steps that a politician or general in Washington won't be making that fall somewhere between what they do and what happens at the tactical level. That in-between zone is the operational level. So if a strategic level decision sent a wing of fighters overseas to enforce a no-fly zone, and the tactical level has a flight lead planning out a DCA cap route, then that leaves another area in the middle that needs to be filled. In that operational level, you would have a commander that gives out locations and times to several DCA caps to patrol the no-fly zone. In the next video, we'll go over how that all actually works out. So I hope you learned something from this video, and I appreciate you taking the time to watch it.